What if a single act of kindness could turn a quiet life into a tidal wave of change, rippling through a town, a community, a nation? On this quiet night of Sunday, May 18, 2025, at 11:36 p.m., let's step into the small, fading town of Ridgefield, Kentucky, where Clara James, a 32-year-old waitress with a brown apron and a heart heavier than the tray she carried, stood up when the world demanded she sit down. Stay with Nibs as we uncover a story that might just make you rethink the power of a warm meal and the courage it takes to offer one. The rain came down sideways, a relentless sheet that blurred the neon open 24 hours sign flickering above Billy's Diner, its pink glow casting jagged reflections on the wet pavement, the kind of light that felt more tired than welcoming. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of grease and coffee, the kind of diner smell that clung to your clothes long after you left, a stubborn reminder of late nights and early mornings. Clara James stood behind the counter, her hands moving on autopilot as she wiped a stubborn ketchup stain with a damp rag, her ponytail tied tight, pulling just enough to keep the weight of the day off her shoulders. Her hazel eyes, sharp and noticing, scanned the room, a middle-aged couple in the corner, stirring their coffee with exaggerated slowness, their conversation a low murmur, a trucker at the counter, hunched over a plate of eggs, his cap pulled low, the radio crackling faintly with a country song nobody seemed to hear. It was a Tuesday evening, quiet as any other, the kind Clara liked, where she could move through her shift unnoticed, filling cups, wiping counters, offering smiles that went unreturned, her canvas shoes worn thin at the soles, whispering softly against the chipped linoleum floor. But what if one moment could define a life forever, a moment no one saw coming, not even Clara herself? In Ridgefield, being invisible wasn't a choice, it was survival. The factory had shut down 3 years ago, leaving the town peeling in slow motion, storefronts boarded up, paint flaking like old memories, the kind that clung to the edges of better days. Clara had grown used to living in the spaces between conversations, her life a patchwork of small kindnesses and invisible burdens, burdens she carried without complaint, without fanfare. She worked double shifts at the diner, opening before the sun rose, closing long after the last regular shuffled out, her hands steady, her heart steady, her dreams tucked away in a shoebox under her bed. No one asked why she worked so hard, no one asked her much at all, but Clara had her reasons, and they all traced back to a small rented room above an auto garage, where a one-eyed tabby named Smokey waited for her each night, his soft purr a quiet comfort, and where that shoebox held her grandfather's Korean War medals, relics of a time when honor meant something, when doing right didn't need an audience. Her grandfather, Henry James, had raised her after her parents vanished into their own storm of mistakes, leaving behind a 5-year-old girl with hazel eyes and a quiet strength she didn't yet know she had. Henry was a veteran with a crooked back, a sharper tongue, and a heart soft as cornbread, his hands calloused from years of labor, his voice rough but warm, his stories a lifeline for a girl who needed roots. He'd taught her discipline, dignity, the kind of courage that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention. "Honor isn't loud, Clara," he'd say, puffing on his old pipe, the smoke curling toward the cracked kitchen window of their tiny apartment, the glass fogging with his breath. "It's quiet, like sweeping the porch before guests come, even if they never show." He'd sit in his old armchair, the springs creaking under his weight, and tell her tales of the war, not the battles, but the moments between, the way a stranger shared a loaf of bread in Busan, 1952, the way a smile could mean more than a medal. When he passed 3 years ago, Clara hadn't cried much at the funeral, not because she didn't hurt, but because she knew he'd want her to stand tall. "Even when you feel small," he'd whisper, his calloused hand resting on her shoulder, her hazel eyes, shining with pride. She'd buried her grief deep, channeling it into survival, double shifts, rent paid on time, a spoonful of tuna for Smokey whenever she could sneak it from the diner's breakroom stash. Survival had gotten harder lately, though, the kind of hard that settled into your bones, that made every step feel like wading through mud. Her roommate had skipped out a month ago, leaving Clara with an overdue utility bill, half a lease, and a landlord with no patience, his voice sharp over the phone, "Pay up or pack up, Clara, I ain't running a charity." She'd dragged her suitcase and a box of essentials to the room above the garage, where the bathroom faucet screamed like a banshee, one outlet sparked if she looked at it wrong, and her savings sat at exactly $64.38, shrinking by the day, a number that stared back at her like a challenge she wasn't sure she could meet. Smokey had meowed once, rubbed his scarred face against her calf, and curled up in a drawer lined with a kitchen towel, his one good eye watching her with quiet trust. That night, Clara stared at the ceiling, the plaster cracked like a map of her worries, one hand resting on the cat's side, his purr a steady rhythm against her palm, and promised herself she'd make it through again. She still got up at 5 a.m., walked to the diner in the rain, smiled at customers who left change as tips, her hands steady despite the weight in her chest, her heart steady despite the storm brewing inside her. People in town called her quiet, but what they meant was she didn't ask for anything, didn't complain when coffee spilled on her shoes, didn't flinch when the cook barked orders through a cloud of grease, didn't argue when her paycheck came up short and the manager told her to be grateful for the work. But Clara noticed everything: the regulars who looked lonelier after their meals, the dishwasher with bruises he couldn't explain, the ones who came in out of the rain asking only for water, their eyes never quite meeting hers, their shame a heavy cloak they couldn't shed. Late at night, she'd hold her grandfather's dog tags in one hand, Smokey in the other, the cat's warmth a quiet anchor, and whisper, "We're okay. We're still okay." The truth was, she was tired, not just bone tired, but soul tired, from pretending, from swallowing injustice, from watching the world while standing on the sidelines, her dreams tucked away like those medals, gathering dust but never forgotten. She never asked for a miracle, she just hoped the roof wouldn't leak again, that the outlet wouldn't spark, that she'd have enough for Smokey's next vet visit, enough to keep going. That Tuesday evening, as the rain hammered the windows, the diner door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold wind that swept across the chipped linoleum floor, the kind of wind that made you shiver even if you were dry. Every head turned for a moment, then turned away, as if looking too long might make them responsible. Eli Turner stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his military coat heavy with water, a faded U.S. Army insignia barely clinging to the sleeve, its threads fraying like his hope. His gray beard was patchy, his left leg dragged behind, bandaged in gauze that had seen better days, the kind of bandage that spoke of neglect, of nights spent under bridges, of a system that had failed him. His hands shook as he removed a soaked knit cap, revealing eyes that held both pain and pride, a quiet fire that hadn't yet gone out. He held a small paper bag close to his chest, like it was made of glass, like it was the only thing he had left to protect. He shuffled to a booth in the far corner, standing beside it, one hand on the backrest for support, as if he didn't dare sit without permission, as if his presence alone might be an imposition. Clara walked over, her towel still in hand, her apron damp from an earlier spill, her voice gentle, steady, the kind of voice that made you feel seen without judgment. "Evening. Can I get you something warm?" He didn't look at her at first, his eyes locked on the floor, as if his presence might get him thrown out, as if he'd been thrown out before. When he finally lifted his head, Clara saw the battle in his gaze, pain and pride fighting for space, a man who'd given everything and been given nothing in return. "Just a cup of hot water, ma'am," he said softly, his voice cracking, not from weakness, but from the weight of asking, the weight of needing. "And maybe, if you've got a crust of bread headed for the trash." Clara's breath caught in her chest, a memory surfacing like a wave, her grandfather's story, a rainy night in Busan, 1952, when a stranger fed him, a young soldier far from home, with those exact words, "a crust of bread headed for the trash." She nodded once, her hazel eyes steady, her voice soft but firm. "I'll see what I can do." In the kitchen, a returned order of chicken and dumplings sat under the heat lamp, untouched, destined for the trash, the steam still rising faintly, a meal that would have been wasted. She plated it carefully, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart, adding extra buttered bread, pouring a fresh cup of black coffee, the kind that could warm you from the inside out. She slid it onto a tray with a small cloth napkin, a touch of dignity in a world that had offered him none, and walked back, her steps measured, her presence calm, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "This was sent back just now," she said, placing it in front of him, her voice matter-of-fact, her smile warm. "Still hot." He looked up, startled, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't pay," he said, his voice barely a whisper, shame creeping into his tone. She cut him off with a smile, the kind that reached her eyes, warm but firm, the kind of smile her grandfather had taught her to give. "It's already paid for, and the coffee's on me." Eli stared at the tray, his eyes watering, as if unsure whether to cry or run, as if kindness was a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Slowly, he wrapped his fingers around the mug, the warmth seeping into his calloused hands, his knuckles scarred and swollen, hands that had once held a rifle, once carried a wounded soldier, once held a family together. "You remind me of my wife," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "She used to do things like this." Said everyone deserved warmth, especially those who lived through too much cold. Clara blinked hard, her throat tightening, trying to keep her own tears at bay, her mind flashing to Henry, the way he'd sit straight despite his crooked back, the way he'd taught her that kindness wasn't about reward, it was about doing right when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. Eli ate slowly, gratefully, holding his fork like it weighed 1,000 pounds, chewing each bite like it was the first solid food in days, his movements deliberate, careful, as if savoring every moment of warmth, every moment of dignity. Clara noticed how he sat straight despite the pain in his leg, how he didn't complain, didn't beg, didn't blame, his posture a quiet testament to the man he'd once been, the man he still was, beneath the layers of hardship. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes watery but clear, a spark of life returning to his gaze. "You just saved a soul tonight, miss," he whispered, his voice trembling with gratitude. "Might have been broken, but not forgotten." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulling out a rusted military dog tag, its chain frayed and dull, the metal scratched but still legible. Pressing it into her palm, he said, "Name's Eli Turner. If I don't make it through this winter, I want someone to know I existed." Before Clara could speak, he stood, his movements slow and painful, his leg dragging behind him, and disappeared into the storm, his silhouette swallowed by the gray, the rain closing around him like a curtain. Clara stood frozen, the tag warm in her hand despite the cold, her heart pounding with a mix of gratitude and sorrow, her hazel eyes tracing the path he'd taken, the door swinging shut with a soft creak. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Rent was still due, Smokey still needed food, the world still spun in its usual indifference, but something in her had shifted, a quiet shift, like a stone settling into a riverbed, changing the current forever. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she'd done something that mattered, even if no one else noticed, even if no one else cared. The front door slammed open, breaking the moment like glass, the sound sharp, jarring, cutting through the diner's hum. Clara barely turned before the voice came, sharp, loud, soaked in disgust. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Wayne Becker, the diner's owner, stood in the kitchen doorway, his thick frame blocking the light, his eyes locked on the empty plate in front of Eli's vacant seat, steam still lingering in the air, as if trying to defend her. His face was red, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists, the kind of man who ruled his small kingdom with fear, not kindness. Clara stood tall, the dog tag tucked safely in her apron pocket, her voice quiet but firm, her spine straight like her grandfather had taught her. "He was a veteran, sir," she said, her hazel eyes meeting his without flinching. "He asked for hot water and a crust of bread. I gave him food that was going to be thrown away." Wayne's voice rose, loud enough to make the handful of customers turn their heads, then quickly look away, their silence a heavier weight than his words. "This ain't a charity, Clara. I've told you before, if people see us feeding street trash for free, they'll think we're a soup kitchen." The couple in the corner went silent, their spoons clinking softly against their mugs, their eyes on their coffee, not on her. No one met her gaze, no one spoke, the diner's warmth turning to ice in their indifference. Clara inhaled deeply, her hands steady despite the storm brewing in her chest, her voice calm, measured. "I paid for the coffee. You can take it out of my tips." Wayne slammed his palm against the counter, the sound like a gunshot, his face redder now, his anger a living thing. "I said no," he barked, his voice echoing off the walls, making the trucker at the counter flinch. "You just made me look soft in front of customers. You don't get to decide how I run this place." Then came the final blow, his voice cold, final, a dagger wrapped in words. "You're fired. Right now. Pack your things and get out." His finger pointed to the door, his eyes hard, unyielding, his authority absolute in his small, crumbling kingdom. The diner grew colder in that moment, not because of the rain outside, but because of what was missing inside: decency, support, anyone willing to say a word in her defense, anyone willing to stand up. The woman in the corner leaned toward her husband, whispering, "That's what happens when you bring trouble inside," her voice sharp, judgmental. Someone else cleared their throat, shifted uncomfortably, and went back to reading the menu, as if none of it mattered, as if Clara's life hadn't just been upended in front of them. Clara's hands trembled as she untied her apron, folding it neatly despite the ache in her chest, her movements deliberate, her dignity intact. She wasn't surprised, not really, disappointed, yes, hurt, absolutely, but surprised, no. What stung worse than Wayne's shouting was the silence from everyone else, the way the diner's warmth turned to ice in her absence, the way no one stood up, no one said she was right, no one even thanked her. She walked out into the pouring rain, her canvas shoes soaking through in seconds, her hair flattening against her forehead, her arms clutching her bag, the rain a cold slap against her skin. Her spine stayed straight, just like her grandfather had taught her, but her heart pounded, a mix of anger and sorrow swirling in her chest, her breath visible in the cold air, her hazel eyes stinging with unshed tears. She stood under the awning for a moment, the rain a curtain between her and the world, her hands trembling, her mind racing. Rent, Smokey, the utility bill, the future, all of it pressing down on her like the storm overhead. She didn't cry, she couldn't afford to not hear, not now, not yet. A rustling sound caught her ear, faint but deliberate, coming from the alley beside the diner, the shadows shifting in the dim streetlight. Eli appeared, hobbling toward her, his breath shallow, his eyes still carrying that quiet fire, his coat dripping, his leg dragging, his presence a quiet defiance against the storm. "I saw what happened," he said, his voice hoarse, heavy with guilt, his hands trembling as he clutched the paper bag tighter. "I shouldn't have let you pay a price for me." Clara shook her head, her voice steady despite the rain dripping down her face, her hazel eyes soft but firm. "You didn't do anything wrong." He reached into his coat again, pressing the dog tag into her hand a second time, as if to make sure she'd keep it, as if it was the only thing he had left to give. "You just saved a shattered soul, child," he said, his voice breaking, tears mixing with the rain on his weathered face. "You reminded me I wasn't invisible." Before she could respond, he turned and vanished into the rain again, leaving her standing there, the tag heavy in her hand, her heart heavier still, the storm swallowing him whole. That night, Clara sat in her tiny room above the garage, Smokey curled against her hip, his one good eye watching her with quiet understanding, his purr a soft comfort in the darkness. A soft meow echoes, rain taps the window, a street lamp hums faintly. Her wet clothes hung awkwardly over a chair, dripping onto the cracked linoleum floor, the only light coming from a street lamp filtering through the blinds, casting slatted shadows across the room, shadows that danced like her worries. On her cracked phone screen, she refreshed her bank account. $42.12 stared back at her, a cold reminder of reality, a number that felt like a ticking clock, rent due in 10 days, no job, no health insurance, no backup plan. But she had something else, courage, and strangely, in a world that had just rejected her, that felt like a kind of wealth, a wealth her grandfather would have understood, would have been proud of. She picked up the dog tag, reading the name etched into its worn metal. Turner, Eli J., serial no. F472, the rest faded, almost unreadable, the metal scratched but warm against her skin. She traced the letters with her thumb, wondering where he had served, what he had lost, why this country, this town, could so easily forget him, why it had forgotten so many like him. She thought of Henry, the way he'd sit in that old armchair, the pipe smoke curling around him, his voice steady as he told her stories, not of glory, but of grit, of the small acts that kept soldiers going, the way a shared meal could mean more than a medal, the way a kind word could mean more than a promotion. She thought of the nights she'd spent as a child, curled up on the couch beside him, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her, the TV flickering with old westerns neither of them really watched, the warmth of his presence enough. She thought of the day he died, the way the hospital room smelled of antiseptic and regret, the way his hand had felt in hers, frail but steady, the way he'd whispered, "Stand tall, Clara," one last time before his breath faded, before the machines went silent, before the world grew a little colder. She hadn't cried then, and she didn't cry now, but the ache was there, a quiet ache, like a bruise you didn't notice until you pressed on it. Smokey shifted, his purr growing louder, as if he knew, as if he understood, his warmth a quiet anchor in the storm of her thoughts. The next morning, her world shifted again, in ways she couldn't have imagined, ways that would echo far beyond Ridgefield, far beyond that rainy night. A soft dawn hum grows into a low rumble, boots shuffle on pavement, a faint murmur of voices swells. She didn't even know a teenager had been filming until the video hit the internet, a shaky, grainy clip shot from across the diner, showing Clara standing with quiet resolve, Wayne's finger jabbing toward the door, his voice loud and ugly, his anger a stark contrast to her calm. By noon, it had spread like wildfire, shared across platforms, picked up by local news, then national outlets, but not in the way she expected, not in the way she would have wanted. The comments were brutal, a flood of judgment from strangers who didn't know her, who didn't care to rules. She should have asked permission. Bet this isn't the first time she gave away food. Maybe she's been stealing. Her former co-workers unfriended her on social media, their messages cold, cutting. One wrote, "Always trying to be the hero. How's that working out now?" The words a knife in her chest, a reminder of how alone she was, how alone she'd always been. Clara applied for jobs at 3 other diners that day, her hands steady as she filled out applications, her handwriting neat despite the tremor in her heart, but her hope sinking with each rejection, each polite smile that didn't reach the eyes. At one place, the manager looked at her, paused, and said gently, "We can't risk the attention, honey." Nothing personal, his voice soft but final, the door closing on another chance. Another didn't even let her finish the application, sliding it back to her with a nod toward the door, his expression blank, as if she were a ghost he didn't want to see. By sundown, she wandered through downtown Ridgefield, cold, damp, exhausted, her coat heavy with the day's weight, her hazel eyes dull with fatigue, her steps slow, deliberate, each one a battle against despair. The dog tag sat in her pocket, a quiet reminder of why she'd done what she did, a reminder of Eli, of Henry, of the kind of courage that doesn't bend, even when the world tries to break it. She passed a bus shelter, its plastic roof sagging under the weight of the rain, the street light casting a faint glow over the cracked pavement, and there, curled up beneath a tattered plastic sheet, was Eli Turner, trying to sleep, one arm covering his chest, the other curled around that same paper bag, his breath shallow, his face etched with exhaustion. Clara knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the wet pavement, the cold seeping through her jeans, and set down a small package wrapped in newspaper, half a sandwich, all she had left from her own meager supplies, the bread a little stale but still good, still something. She whispered, "Thank you for remembering me," her voice soft but steady, her hazel eyes shining with unshed tears, before standing and walking away, her footsteps fading into the quiet night, unaware that a black military vehicle had pulled up at the corner, its tinted windows reflecting the last light of day, its engine idling softly, a man in uniform watching her go, his jaw tight, his hand reaching for his phone to make a call. The rain stopped just before dawn, leaving behind a town scrubbed in silence, the streets shimmering with thin puddles that reflected the first golden light breaking through the low-hanging clouds, the kind of light that felt like a promise, even if you didn't believe in promises anymore. A soft dawn hum grows into a low rumble, boots shuffle on pavement, a faint murmur of voices swells into a crowd. Ridgefield's downtown was still asleep, storefronts dark, traffic lights blinking yellow in the quiet air, thick with the smell of wet pavement and something else, anticipation, the kind that hangs heavy before a storm, the kind that makes your skin prickle. At exactly 6:45 a.m., the rumble began, not from engines, not from footsteps, but from presence, a presence that filled the narrow main street, that stopped time itself. One by one, black SUVs pulled into the street, forming a quiet procession that stopped in front of Billy's Diner, their doors opening with military precision, their occupants stepping out in unison. The first to emerge was a man in a sharply pressed U.S. Army uniform, his chest lined with medals, shoulders squared like a man still carrying a battlefield on his back. Colonel Matthew Turner, Eli's son, his gray eyes hard but steady, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding without a word. He paused outside the diner's door and waited, his cap tucked under his arm, his posture a testament to discipline, to duty. Behind him, like an unfolding pageantry of reverence, they came, a line of soldiers, rows and rows of them, dressed in full-service uniform, emerging from vehicles and side streets, some Army, some Marines, others Navy and Air Force, all standing in perfect formation along the diner's entrance, stretching down the block, silent and unmoving, their faces a mix of gratitude and resolve, their hands steady at their sides. Cars slowed, their drivers craning their necks to see, pedestrians froze, their morning routines forgotten, shopkeepers peered through their windows, their hands still on the blinds, their breaths fogging the glass. In a town where nothing ever happened, this was something, this was everything. Inside the diner, Wayne Becker had just finished restocking the napkin holders, his movements sluggish, his mind on the night before Clara's defiance, the way she'd walked out without a word, the way he'd thought that was the end of it, the way he'd thought he'd won. The bell above the door jingled, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the quiet, and he looked up, nearly dropping the glass he was holding, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear, but might have been shame. Colonel Turner stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room, his voice calm but commanding, the kind of voice that brooked no argument, that demanded attention. "I'd like to speak to the owner," he said, his gray eyes locking onto Wayne's, his gaze steady, piercing. Wayne stepped forward, suddenly pale, his hands fidgeting at his sides, his voice barely above a whisper, cracking with nerves. I'm the owner," he stammered, his eyes darting to the soldiers outside, to the crowd gathering, to the phones already recording, capturing every moment. More people had filtered in from the street, drawn by whispers and camera phones, the crowd outside growing, their murmurs a low hum, a wave of curiosity, of anticipation. Colonel Turner removed his cap, his gray eyes never leaving Wayne's, his voice steady, each word a weight, each word a judgment. "My name is Colonel Matthew Turner, son of Eli Turner." Silence cracked like thunder, the air in the diner thickening, the tension palpable, the weight of his words settling over the room like a storm cloud. Wayne's mouth opened, but no words came, his face draining of color, his hands trembling now, his authority crumbling under the colonel's gaze. Turner continued, his voice steady, laced with emotion, each word a testament to a debt he could never repay. "The man you humiliated here yesterday, he's the reason I'm alive." The air grew heavier, the kitchen going still, the cook pausing mid-chop, his knife hovering over a cutting board, his breath held, the entire diner holding its breath. "In 2007, during my third deployment to Iraq, our convoy was ambushed," Turner said, his voice steady but heavy with memory, his gray eyes distant, seeing a battlefield far from the small diner. "My transport was hit. 12 of us were trapped, pinned down under enemy fire, the kind of fire that doesn't stop, that doesn't care. Your beggar carried me 3 miles through that hell, with shrapnel in his own leg, his blood soaking the sand, his breath ragged, his body screaming, but he didn't stop, he didn't falter. He refused treatment until we were all safe, until every last one of us was accounted for." He reached into his coat, pulling out a laminated citation, its edges worn but the words clear, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant, a silver star, awarded to Eli Turner for gallantry in action, for courage beyond the call of duty. "This is his," Turner said, holding it up for all to see, the metal catching the diner's fluorescent light, its silver surface a stark contrast to the dimness of the room. Wayne's eyes darted around, looking for someone, anyone, to defend him, to stand with him, to tell him this wasn't happening, but no one moved, no one spoke, the silence a judgment of its own. The colonel's voice cracked slightly, a rare vulnerability breaking through, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "He refused help for years," he said, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "After my mother died, his PTSD got worse, the kind of darkness that swallows you whole, that makes the world feel like a battlefield you can't escape. He disappeared, slipped through the cracks, and we searched for months, my family, my unit, anyone who'd listen. And now we find him here fed and sheltered, not by the system, not by this town, but by a waitress, one you fired, one you threw out into the rain like she was nothing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd outside, phones capturing every word, hashtags already forming, hashtag Ridgefield Diner, hashtag Honor the Forgotten, hashtag Justice for Clara, the story spreading like wildfire, a spark that would soon become a blaze. Turner slipped into a steadier rhythm, his voice rising with purpose, his words a call to action, a call to remember. "Michael Rutherford earned medals most men only dream of, medals forged in blood and sacrifice, but he told me once, medals don't feed the hungry. So he pawned this, his silver star, to buy food for a homeless family, to give them what this country couldn't, what this town wouldn't." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the faces of the customers, the staff, the crowd outside, his voice softer now, but piercing, cutting through the silence like a knife. "The waitress who stood up for him yesterday reminded me of the country he thought he'd lost, the country he fought for, the country he bled for." At that cue, a young corporal stepped through the door, his movements precise, his uniform crisp, holding a small black case, the kind of case that held something precious, something sacred. Inside, the very metal Eli had pawned, its silver surface catching the light, a symbol of sacrifice, of redemption. Turner turned to the door, his voice firm, a command that carried the weight of his rank, of his duty. "Bring her here." Clara had no idea what was happening until a knock rattled the door of her rented room above the garage, the sound sharp, urgent, cutting through the quiet morning. A sharp knock echoes, Smokey meows softly, a distant murmur of voices grows louder. A local reporter, flushed and breathless, stood there, a camera crew behind her, their equipment clattering in the narrow hallway, their voices a chaotic hum. "They're asking for you," the reporter said, her voice urgent, her eyes wide with excitement. "The soldiers, the whole block is shut down. Colonel Turner, you have to come now." Clara thought she was dreaming, her heart pounding as she followed the reporter, Smokey watching from the windowsill, his one eye glinting in the dawnlight, his tail flicking with curiosity, as if he knew something big was coming. As she approached the diner, the line of soldiers parted slightly, their movements precise, disciplined, a sea of uniforms stretching down the block, their faces a mix of reverence and gratitude. Then, at once, they all raised their right hands to their foreheads, 200 soldiers saluting her, a waitress, their hands steady, their eyes steady, their salute a silent thank you, a silent promise. Clara froze, her throat tightening, her breath catching in her chest, her hazel eyes wide with disbelief, her hands trembling at her sides, her mind racing, whiny. What did I do? No one spoke, no one needed to, the silence louder than any words, the weight of their gratitude a tangible thing, pressing against her chest, filling her heart. Colonel Turner stepped forward, presenting the medal, his voice steady but warm, his gray eyes softening, a rare smile tugging at his lips. My father wanted you to have this, he said, holding out the silver star, its surface gleaming in the morning light, a symbol of everything Eli had given, everything Clara had honored. Clara shook her head, trembling, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes shining with tears. I can't. It's not mine. Turner gently placed it in her hand, his touch firm but kind, his voice a quiet promise. It is now. The fallout was swift, a storm of its own kind, a reckoning that Ridgefield couldn't ignore. A distant murmur grows into a crowd's hum, a shutter clicks, a faint chant begins, honor our heroes. The diner closed the next day, its suppliers canceling orders, their voices cold over the phone. We don't work with places that disrespect veterans, their words a judgment Wayne couldn't escape. Staff resigned one by one, their letters short, their reasons clear. I can't work for someone who'd do that, one wrote, her handwriting shaky but firm. Veterans groups picketed the front steps, their signs bold, their voices louder, honor our heroes, shame on Billy's, justice for Clara, the words echoing down the street, a chorus of accountability. Wayne Becker vanished from town within weeks, his name whispered in grocery aisles and barbershops, a cautionary tale of what happens when you forget what matters, when you choose pride over decency, when you turn your back on the very people who built the world you stand on. But Clara didn't gloat, didn't make statements, didn't post on social media, didn't seek the spotlight that so many others chased. She simply returned to doing what she did best, serving with quiet strength, her hazel eyes steady, her hands steady, her heart steady, her life a testament to the lessons Henry had taught her, the lessons Eli had reminded her of. A veteran-founded nonprofit reached out within days, their letter arriving in a simple envelope, the kind that held hope, not promises, offering her a full-time job managing a new community kitchen in an old warehouse that once stored broken vending machines, a space that had been forgotten, just like so many of the people it would soon serve. Laughter echoes softly, a pot clangs gently, the smell of chili drifts through the air. The lights in the Ridgefield community kitchen stayed on late into the night, laughter echoing down the hallways, the smell of chili, cornbread, and warm coffee drifting out through the doors, a warmth that wasn't just physical, but emotional, spiritual, the kind of warmth that heals. Clara stood at the heart of it all, not as a manager on paper, but as the heartbeat of a family that grew around her, a family that wasn't bound by blood, but by shared purpose, shared kindness. Former soldiers peeled potatoes beside single mothers, their hands steady, their laughter a quiet rebellion against the hardships they'd faced. High school volunteers ladled soup next to retired nurses, their voices bright, their smiles brighter, their presence a reminder that hope could grow anywhere, even in a town like Ridgefield. Smokey, now a beloved fixture, watched over it all from a windowsill, his one good eye glinting like a war-weary general with a soft heart, his purr a quiet approval of the life Clara had built, the life he'd always known she could build. The kitchen wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place to belong, a place to be seen, a place to heal, a place where the forgotten found a home, where the invisible found a voice. 1 week after the salute that changed everything, as the kitchen wound down for the day, the door creaked open, a soft sound that cut through the quiet hum of cleanup, the clatter of pots being washed, the murmur of volunteers sharing stories. A soft creak of a door echoes, small footsteps shuffle, a faint clink of coins rings out. A small boy walked in, no more than 7 or 8, with sandy hair, oversized sneakers that slapped against the floor, and a serious expression that made him look older than his years. In one hand, he held a dollar bill folded carefully in thirds, in the other, a cookie wrapped in wax paper, tied with string, the kind of careful wrapping that spoke of intention, of care. He walked straight to the counter and looked up at Clara, his voice clear, determined, his blue eyes bright with purpose. "I saw you in the video," he said, his words steady despite his small frame. "My grandpa was a soldier, too. He used to help people, so I wanted to help someone, too." He placed the cookie and the dollar on the counter, his small hands steady, his gesture a quiet echo of the kindness Clara had shown, a kindness that had rippled outward, touching lives she'd never even met. Clara knelt beside him, her hands on her knees, her hazel eyes shining with unshed tears, her throat tight with emotion, her heart full in a way she hadn't thought possible. "Can I use this to help someone else?" he asked, his voice small but earnest, his eyes searching hers for approval, for connection. She didn't speak for a long moment, her throat too tight, her heart too full, the weight of his gesture pressing against her chest, a reminder of why she'd done what she did, why she'd keep doing it. Instead, she placed her hand over her heart, the same way 200 soldiers had done days earlier, and gave him a quiet nod, no speech, no grand gesture, just one kind act echoing forward, a chain of kindness that stretched from a rainy night in a diner to this moment, to this boy, to the future. Eli Turner, the veteran who started it all, now had a roof over his head and regular care at a nearby VA housing unit, his room small but clean, his meals warm, his days filled with visits from his son, from younger soldiers who came just to sit and listen to his stories, not just of battles overseas, but of quiet ones fought right here at home, stories of survival, of resilience, of the kindness of a waitress who'd seen him when no one else would. Clara visited when she could, bringing Smokey along, the cat curling up beside Eli as they sat in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need words, the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, of gratitude. She still carried his dog tag, still kept the silver star in a simple wooden box beside her bed, next to her grandfather's medals, a folded flag, a photograph of Henry smiling in his uniform, his crooked back straight for the camera, his hazel eyes shining with pride. Some nights, she'd run her fingers over the medal's edges, the metal cool against her skin, and whisper the words her grandfather once told her, "Honor isn't something loud. It's quiet," her voice soft, steady, a promise she'd keep for the rest of her life. Soft piano fades in, a distant hum of a busy kitchen, laughter echoes faintly, the smell of warm bread fills the air. Months passed, then years, the story fading from headlines, the video scrolling down the feed of yesterday's outrage, but those who had seen it, who had really seen it, remembered, not because Clara stood up, but because she did so when it was hardest, because she gave without expecting anything back, because in a world that too often forgets its quiet heroes, she reminded everyone what dignity looks like when no one is clapping, when no one is watching, when no one cares. The diner where she once worked now sat dark and empty, its neon sign cold, a sun-bleached for lease notice flapping behind the window, a ghost of a place that had once been the center of her world, a place that had tried to break her but couldn't. Across town, the Ridgefield Community Kitchen thrived, its doors open to anyone who needed a warm meal, a kind word, a moment of belonging, its walls filled with laughter, with stories, with hope. Clara stood at the counter one evening, her apron now a soft green, her ponytail looser, her hazel eyes brighter than they'd ever been, a quiet light shining within them, a light that had always been there but had needed a moment like this to shine. The kitchen buzzed around her, volunteers laughing as they chopped vegetables, a young girl practicing her reading aloud to a retired nurse, her voice halting but determined, Smokey purring softly on his perch, his one eye glinting with approval. Clara looked out the window, the sunset casting a golden glow over the street, the kind of glow that felt like a promise she could believe in now. She thought of her grandfather, of Eli, of the boy with the cookie, of the soldiers who had saluted her, of the life she'd built from a single act of kindness, a life that wasn't perfect, but was hers, was meaningful, was enough. She didn't need the world's applause, she had something better: purpose, family, a legacy of quiet courage that would outlast any headline, any hashtag, any storm. On Nibs, we tell true-hearted stories, stories that remind us honor is quiet, that kindness can change everything, that courage doesn't need a spotlight to shine. Have you ever stood up for someone when it wasn't easy, when the world told you to sit down? Share your thoughts below, your story might inspire someone else to act, to stand, to give. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes in quiet courage, someone who knows that the smallest acts can create the biggest waves. Thank you for spending this night with Nibs, for being part of something meaningful, one story at a time.